I'm Margaret Levy, and I'm the current editor of the Annual Review of Political Science and a professor at the University of Washington. And I'm very pleased to be here with Professor Robert Dahl, Professor Emeritus of Yale University, Department of Political Science, and former president of the American Political Science Association, and one of the true giants in the field of political science. And this is a great honor. This is our first prefatory interview piece for the Annual Review of Political Science, and I can think of no one better for that task than you, Bob.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here with you.
Bob, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your history and how you got into political science and some of the things that you did before you became a political scientist.
Certainly. I don't know how much of that you want to me to narrate. It can go on endlessly, as my children and grandchildren have learned. But I grew up in this little town in southeastern Alaska. I worked summers, partly to help pay my way through college and then later graduate school, where I came into contact with, of course, they were local people whom I already knew, but also on the docks, people whom I didn't know, working people. And that exposed me to an aspect of life which I've never forgotten.
So you were involved with the International Longshore and Warehouse Union before it became that?
Before it became that, and I was a great advocate, feeling then partly because I was a Norman Thomas socialist and a radical and an advocate of unions and so on, and I felt that they needed to be organized. And then in due time, they did indeed get organized, and one of the first things that they did quite properly was to turn it into a year-round job, and I was no longer able to work on the docks.
Right. And you were quite a young man when you were doing that, 12 or...
Yeah, I started out at the age of 12, which of course would be totally illegal now. Right. But I was big and strong, and so it wasn't really a problem. And it was an important part of my life, yeah.
And it informed your work later, I take it.
It did. I had that and my military service and growing up in a small town, it just gave me a very deep and lasting respect for what is often said ordinary people. I think that, I don't like that term, but just plain ordinary human beings. I respect them for, among other things, so that they've got degrees of common sense which are not always so obviously present in our colleagues and other intellectuals.
And did that experience have an influence on the way in which you thought about democracy? That's been, of course, one of your major contributions is democratic theory.
Yes. I think it gave me, and without ever, I think, ever romanticizing, because these were not people you'd romanticize as somehow super people or anything like that, but it gave me a very deep and lasting respect for the common sense and the abilities of human beings at the same of human beings, adults. At the same time, it increased my awareness of the importance of information and the challenge that posed. Therefore, the challenge of education, challenges of education, and the great gap between what people need to know in order to protect their own self-interest and what they do know, which of course in some Platonic and other theories is filled in by those who believe that they know best, a view which, as you know, I've always greatly distrusted.
Right. Maybe you could tell us a little bit why it was that you began to develop the kind of theory of democracy and poliarchy that you did.
I had this sense that ideas about democracy, theories of democracy, which I had learned about, of course, from graduate school on, and from Aristotle and Plato onward historically, that they were inadequate in this is, I don't want to diminish them. I've always retained a great respect for classical and medieval and 18th century theory. But that meanwhile, a whole new kind of political system to which the term democracy became attached, and for which democracy remained an ideal, even though classical democracy as an ideal was so far removed from the reality. That the gap between that ideal and the actual political institutions that had developed, particularly from about the 16th, 17th century on, was just enormous. And that what we didn't have enough of, we didn't have very little of, was an adequate description of what the actual institutions of so-called democracy, modern democracy, representative democracy, were. And they were, as I've already said, they were radically different from historical democracy, but our descriptions of them and how they related to the ideals, I felt at that time was lacking.
And how did you get from democracy to polyarchy? What was that move? What did that represent?
Yes, I came to the conclusion quite early on. Polyarchy was a term that I think had been developed in the 18th century, as you know, from its roots, just meaning many rulers, polyarchon. And I came to the conclusion early on that trying to use the word democracy in both its ideal and in its realistic sense, particularly since the actual democracies had evolved with representation and the growth of political parties into a whole new species. It was a whole new different kind of political system that we needed then language, or needed to modify our language, so that we could describe democracy as an ideal, using the term democracy there. But that we needed a term, and never actually became a household term, that we needed a term that described where we knew we were talking about actual 18th, 19th, 20th century democracies. And I stumbled on the word polyarchy and started applying that. As I say, it didn't become a term, but I think we're probably now more, though I do think it's still confusing that the term applies to both. But I think we're a little bit more comfortable now, perhaps, than we were in making sure which it is we're talking about. And when we use the word democracy, whether we're talking about small-scale democracy, large-scale democracy, polyarchy, as I would call it, multi-party democracy, it's become a whole, much more diverse, much more complex